Today, we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. So I invite you to open up your Bibles or your Bible apps to Daniel. It's about halfway through, maybe a little bit more than halfway through your Bible. While you're looking up Daniel, let me just tell you a little bit about him. It's very timely today, because you might not think of this. When you think of Daniel, what do you think of? You think of the lion's den, and we're going to talk about that later on. But believe it or not, Daniel was probably the most political wonk kind of person in the Old Testament that we have today. He was one of what we would call the president's men. Does that make sense? He never served as the president or the leader, but he served leaders. He was known to be really exceptional at what he did. In fact, he served 4 different leaders from different places. We're going to take a look at that in a moment. So today, we're going to get 6 life lessons that are very timely for us today. Children, I'm glad that you're here today too, because this is something that you say, well, politics, am I really interested in politics? Well, you might be interested in how to be a leader in the class and what to look for in the leaders that you follow. So today, we're going to look at that from Daniel. And the very first life lesson that we walk away with today is this, that earthly kings come and go. So let's focus our attention on the true King of Kings. Earthly kings come and go. So focus on the true King of Kings. Let me read some different verses from the book of Daniel just to give you some idea of the spread of leaders that were involved in this short little book. From Daniel 1:1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. All right, so we got the king of Judah, Jehoiakim. Then comes along Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. And then we switch our attention 5 chapters over to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, and we read that King Belshazzar gave a great banquet. And then we shift gears again to verse 30 at the end of chapter 5, and we see that that very night Belshazzar was slain and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. And then we shift gears again, this time over to chapter 10, verse 1. And we read that in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now, why did I take little snippets of all these verses and put them together for you? Well, I want to give you just a little bit of background. First of all, we have the Israelites who are being led by their king Jehoiakim. And the Babylonians come in and they besiege the city, they take it over, and then they take the very best of all the young men, including Daniel and his friends, and take them back to Babylonia. And we have a new king who is now in charge of all of Babylon, now including Jerusalem, and his name is Nebuchadnezzar. He is now the new king. And then his son, King Belshazzar, takes over, and then he's there for a very short period of time. He gets killed, and Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom. And then the Persians come over, and they take over what the Babylonians were doing, and now we have Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now you say, well, do I really care about all this? Well, you probably really don't. But here's why it's important for us this morning. If you could imagine one man who served all the different 4 or 5 presidents of the United States, you'd say that that man was pretty wise. You would say that that man knows what he's doing. If I were then to say, well, you know, it didn't matter whether they were a Republican or a Democrat, both parties wanted this guy to be on their team. But that doesn't come close to it either. Here's what you have to understand. Let's say, for example, that this place was America, and it was led by presidents, and here is a man who serves the president. But then the United States is taken over by Canada, and Canada has a prime minister. They don't have a president. But this guy is so valuable that the prime minister of Canada, who's taken over the United States, says, you know, I want this guy to help me. And then Russia comes in and takes over what Canada took over, and they have a czar, and the czar says, you know, this guy is so valuable, I would like him to help me in my administration. Okay, that's what you get here with Daniel. I know that what I just gave you was kind of a far out illustration, but that's what Daniel does. It didn't matter whether it was a king or whether it was a president, whether it was one country or another. It didn't matter what the government was involved. Daniel was so wise and so helpful that all of the different leaders of the different countries wanted him on their team. All right? Daniel was just never full of himself. Daniel was humble about who he was and what he could do. He worshiped God. He made sure he did that, but he never made a big deal of it of himself. All right? He never lifted himself up in how smart he was or how wise he was. And so I think it's important for us today in our own political struggles to remember this principle that earthly kings come and go, but we focus our attention on the true King of Kings. Just keep your finger in Daniel for a moment and switch over to the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. We're given this advice that we, Christians, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now, I believe that today's talk for us, whether we're adults or whether we're children, I think is important for us to just take a step aside and understand the environment that we are in today. Today, and I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't already know, no matter which side of this political argument you are on, today's political environment in our country is so divisive that we forget that the real battle is not what is televised by the talking heads on news each night. And especially as we go into, an election on Tuesday night, and we have people who supposedly are on the same side putting each other down and telling you why one person is not what they seem to be or why somebody else isn't what they seem to be and why, it seems like everybody is so focused on telling you what's bad about the other person that we don't have room for finding out what's good about the person you want to vote for. And so we get wrapped up in this whole political mess and we forget that this isn't our battle. This isn't what we're about. The real battle is what we don't see that goes beyond that. And that brings us to number 2. Well, okay, Mark, what do we do about this? If you say this isn't the real thing, what is a real battle? That is a spiritual battle. Number 2, when you are objecting to laws or to rules, especially when you think that they are unfair or that they are wrong, that you object in a way that you demonstrate reason and respect. Reason and respect. Those are 2 words that do not also seem to describe us as a country very well right now. But we read from Daniel very quickly on in this little story in chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. All right, so here we have Daniel showing reason and respect even as a young man. So what's going on here? Well, Daniel is following all of his life as a Hebrew young man. He is following a very strict dietary regimen of what he can eat and what he cannot eat. And now he's taken over by these new Babylonians, and he is actually treated very well. He is given very rich foods. He's given royal food, royal wine, right? And you think, well, that sounds like a good deal, but actually not for him, because to eat or drink that food or that drink would go against what he has been brought up to believe and to follow. So what does Daniel do? Well, let's stop and think for just a moment what we see many of the people who disagree with somebody else do, what you watch on television every single night. We don't see Daniel stage a protest. We don't see Daniel getting himself on the news. We don't see Daniel writing an op-ed about the unfairness of the situation. We don't see Daniel getting a group of people together in front of the cameras saying, no, no, we won't go. But that's what we would expect. That's what we see today. Here's what the Bible tells us that Daniel did. And I think, especially young people, when you're thinking about things that are unfair and not right, then you just believe it's wrong to the core of who you are, you could take a lesson. We all could take a lesson from what Daniel did as a young man. We see two things. Number one, he resolved. And number two, he asked. Wow, that wouldn't make the news here, would it? But then he follows that up with a test. Underlying all of this was Daniel's ability to see the situation, and I'm afraid that we have lost this completely in our country today. Daniel was able, through all of this, to see the situation from the other guy's perspective. And we don't seem to do that today very much, I'm afraid. You see, for Daniel here, he knew that the one ruling over him had rules that he himself had to follow. And that the guy who was ruling over him, his boss, would be facing penalties of his own if Daniel didn't eat the royal food and wine and suffered as a result. So he goes to this boss and he says, look, for 10 days, let me just follow what we do. And you compare me and my friends to all the other people who ate the royal food and wine and see for yourself if we don't have a glow about us compared to everybody else. And so the boss said, fine, I'll give that a try. And at the end of that period of time, the boss knew that Daniel and his friends were going to be just fine and that he was going to be just fine. I think we could take a lesson, all of us. You say, well, Mark, is there anything here? Are you just kind of chicken about objecting and making a big deal out of things that are wrong? No. But I am very much aware of what the New Testament instructions are for us and how we are to follow and obey the political environment that we find ourselves in, regardless of what that political environment is. Turn your attention to Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Again, it doesn't matter what side of the issue you're on. If you call yourself a Christian, this is what you're supposed to do. What does it say here? Titus 3, 1 and 2. Remind them. This is Paul writing to Titus, and the them is all of us. Okay, remind all the people in your care. Remind the flock. Remind the church. Remind the Christians to what? To be submissive to rulers and authorities. To be obedient. To be ready for every good work. To, I hope that this next part gets some airtime on the internet, all right? Because this is from the Bible. To speak evil of no one. To avoid quarreling. Ooh. To be gentle. To show perfect courtesy to all people. You say, what am I supposed to do in a political environment as a Christ follower? Titus 3, 1 and 2. That's it right there. Now compare this instruction from Paul to Titus with our own political discourse today. And rather than apply this, because this is what we're tempted to do, by the way, to apply this to all the talking heads that we see on television today, or to apply it to the political candidates, or to those who are serving in office, and to say, boy, those guys got it really bad. No, let's not ever do that. Let's check ourselves against these very instructions. So let's go back through that again and just ask yourself, over this last month, how have you done when you have disagreed with somebody? Have you been submissive to authorities? Have you been obedient? Have you been ready for every good work, even if you disagreed with somebody? Have you not spoken evil of someone else? Have you done your best to avoid quarreling? Have you been gentle? Have you shown perfect courtesy to all people? Now, you see, when we point that finger back at us, it's a lot more uncomfortable, isn't it? All right? Now let's go back to Daniel, all right? So here's the situation. The new king's in town, Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel has shown himself to be a wise guy and to be able to interpret dreams. And so he's among all the wise dream interpreters. Dream interpretation was a big deal back then, all right? And King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it really bothers him. But he wants to make sure that when he's asking his wise guys about his dream, that he doesn't tell them the dream. That what he says to his wise guys is, no. What I want to do is I want to see if you really are who you say you are. So you've got to tell me what my dream is, and then you have to interpret it. Oh, now that's a whole different test, right? And not surprisingly, nobody can do it. Because how are we supposed to know what your dream is? Right? Well, Nebuchadnezzar gets pretty upset. And the one thing about kings is, back in that day for sure, if you were upset, a lot of people lost their heads. And so he was just going to kill all the wise guys in the kingdom. And by the way, because Daniel was part of that group, he was going to lose his life too. So we come back to Daniel chapter 2, verse 14. When Arioch, okay, now who's Arioch? It explains right here. He's the commander of the king's guard. He has gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon. And then Daniel spoke to him, and get this, what? With wisdom and tact. You see this over and over again, this theme that applies to wisdom with Daniel, with wisdom and tact. And notice those words, wisdom and tact. Now this, I would think, would be really hard to do when one's life is on the line, right? Wouldn't it be hard? I mean, what would be your first argument? I know what my first argument would be. What? No way. No, you can't. That's not fair. Just because I can't tell you the guy's dream, or they couldn't tell you the guy's dream? No, you're going to cut off my head? No, that's not right. Where's the Bill of Rights? Right? I mean, you know, that would be what I would be. But no, what he does is he's got trust and faith in God. And out of that trust and faith in God comes wisdom and tact. And so Daniel knows that it's unfair, but he also knows he has to be wise, he has to be tactful. So that leads us to number 3. And this is really important for all of us to get. No matter what your age is today, when fighting wrong laws or rules, turn to God. This is just as much true, students, for you at school as it is for us adults. When fighting wrong laws or rules, because not every law is right or just, not every rule is right or just. There are times when we come up against wrong laws, wrong rules. Our very first response should be to turn to God. So, again, we go back to Daniel. Same chapter, same place. Daniel 2, verses 17 and 18. Daniel then returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven, so that he and his friends might not be executed. See, that was his first response. Turn to God. Trusted prayer warriors, a trusted prayer network of people is so vitally important for us. And Daniel here remembers and relies upon God first before he relies on himself. We do it just the opposite, by the way. Most of the time, no matter how long you've been a Christian, what we tend to do is rely on ourselves first and then turn to God when we have no more options. We turn to God when things that we've tried aren't working anymore, and now it's, you know, the last thing that we have to try. I remember I was with a group of people, and I said, well, you know, maybe we should pray about this. And somebody said, has it come to that? Like that would be the last thing we would do. No, it's the first thing. And it's remarkable, really, in a panicked moment. But Daniel remembered his prayer warriors. He asked his friends to pray too. I have noticed one important difference between experienced, mature Christ followers and those who claim Christianity, and maybe for a long period of time, but they really don't show a lot of faith in their Christianity. You know what I'm talking about? People who claim their faith, but they don't often show a lot of faith. And that is this difference, that mature Christians invest into prayer for themselves and to others. They have a network of people that they know that they can count on, that will pray for them. And they make themselves known as someone that if you need prayer, I will pray for you. Do you have that kind of network? Do you have that kind of connection? Do you know that if something comes up today that you are really struggling with, do you know those 5, 6, 7 dozen people that you can count on, that you can turn to, that you know would be praying for you? Then be ready to go at a moment's notice. That's what Daniel has here. To be able to turn to God in that kind of moment really does require some thinking ahead on your part. You cannot count on yourself to be wise enough to know when you're in a stressful situation that you would do the right thing. That's why you need to surround yourself with prayer warriors. Because sometimes people can see the situation a little bit more clearly than you, especially when you're right in the middle of it. So Daniel, let's go back to Daniel here. He goes to his prayer network. And through prayer, he makes it known up to Nebuchadnezzar that he will tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream and that he will then interpret it. And so that goes up to Nebuchadnezzar, and to kind of make a long story short, Daniel does exactly that. He tells Nebuchadnezzar about this really strange dream, and then he tells him what it's all about. And through this, and by the way, here's another lesson. We don't have to write this one down, but as I'm preaching here to you this morning, I'm thinking I should have included this. All right? Sometimes the opportunity that stress brings when we're in prayer shows us also an opportunity that we wouldn't have had otherwise when God is on our side. You see, it was actually through this stressful time that Daniel becomes one of Nebuchadnezzar's most trusted allies, most trusted advisors. And so God literally takes this bad news and turns it into a positive situation. And really, Daniel becomes known for being able to give bad news in a very straightforward way. Because sometimes the dreams that he interpreted weren't that great. If you read on, and again, we don't have time to preach all of it this morning, but eventually Belshazzar becomes the son of Nebuchadnezzar, becomes a commander, and he has a dream of this hand floating, on this wall. And so who can interpret dreams better than anybody? It's Daniel. He calls Daniel in, and Daniel says, yeah, I'm sorry. This is really bad news for you, but your life is about to end. And you would think that would be like off with your head kind of thing. But instead, the king responds very positively to it. Now, it comes true. Belteshazzar's gone, and then the other Persian comes in. Darius the Mede becomes his boss. And Daniel so distinguishes himself. In fact, here's what we see, number 4. Godly administration and leadership is truly exceptional. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself. This is Daniel 6:3. Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps. That would be like among the governors and among the senators. Okay? They're all political leaders. By his exceptional qualities that the king, we could call that the president, planned to set Daniel over the whole kingdom. By the way, this is a theme that we see often, right? It kind of sounds a little bit like back in the Old Testament when we saw Joseph with the Pharaoh, right? Pharaohs and kings like it when somebody else will take care of all the details in a way that he doesn't have to mess with, right? That was the kind of guy that Daniel was. Now stop and think about this for just a moment because this is really so amazing. Just not to repeat myself over again, but I have learned that if you say it multiple times, eventually somebody gets it. Daniel is a conquered Israelite who serves a Babylonian king who himself is conquered and then serves the new king so well that he puts Daniel in charge of all the others. That's the life of Daniel. Important lesson for us today, because really one of the things that I think we should take away from this is that our religious faith should never be an excuse for why we cannot serve in government well, or in business well, or in any other capacity well. And the fact that we have a faith and that it's a solid faith and that we rely upon God, that should be a positive, not a negative. Men and women who faithfully rely upon God to help them rule well, they should be the best leaders and administrators and politicians that we could have. Now hear me for what I'm about to say as it relates to Daniel, and I think so much to us today too. This is true not because the people who are really honest Christ followers who follow God should be great administrators, could be great administrators, right? This is true not because they wear their religion as a sash for everybody to see so that like-minded people will vote for him or her. That's not what Daniel did. Daniel didn't go around promoting himself as a Hebrew follower of God and say, look at me, everybody. I pray 3 times a day. No. He just did it and was a good ruler. And they liked him for his ability to administer and rule. Had, in their mind, nothing to do with his religion. But you and I know it had everything to do with it because he genuinely followed God's leadership. What does Daniel do, and what should we be looking for when we go into the voting booth on Tuesday? We should be looking for people who live out their faith so well that people want to follow them because they are exceptional in their leadership. And they're exceptional in their leadership because their faith in God makes it possible. Not because they claim a faith in God, but because they genuinely have great leadership, and behind the scenes, God is working in their life. Does that make sense to you? That brings us down to number 5. This is the opposite side of this. I'm giving you both sides. By the way, children, students, I should say, anybody who just tells you one side of a story, you need to be saying, hey, can you tell me the other side? Because there's always 2 sides to every coin, right? There's always 2 sides to every story. Here's the second side to this story, and that is this, number 5, exceptional and godly leadership in this world will be challenged. All right? Yeah, let's go on to Daniel 6, 4, and 16. So now these are all, remember those satraps and administrators that we talked about before in Daniel 6, 3? The senators and the governors, right? That the king set Daniel over. Do you think that they liked the fact that Daniel was set over all of them? No. And so they, in verse 4 and 16, they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel, but they were unable to do so. And then skipping over to 16, they could find no corruption in him, and so they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Now, I skipped a little bit of the story there, so let me tell you the rest of the story. Let me fill in the blanks here. You might think that exceptional and godly leadership would be cherished by all people, but it's not. Sadly, that's not the world in which we live. On multiple occasions, I've had to remind you that this is earth and not heaven. We're not in heaven yet. We're not in glory yet. We're not where God's will is done all the time perfectly. That's not what describes this place. So when you're doing God's will to the best of your ability and you're in this world isn't always going to like what you do. When someone rises so far in responsibility in government or in business or at school, they're always, and this really is an always statement. I mean, I've never found an exception to this. I hate it when people say always, but I think this is an always. There's always going to be somebody around who's going to be resentful of you. all right? And rather than learn from the exceptional leader what makes him or her so exceptional and benefit from it, the resentful person will oftentimes just look for excuses for themselves. And this is the kind of stuff that you hear. This is the kind of thing that you're hearing right now. That's why this message, I think, is so timely. When I turn on the television, I turn on the radio, I just get sick of commercials around political season. Because we hear this. Yeah, he was just at the right place at the right time. Right? He had the inside track. Well, it's his Hebrew faith. You know how they stick together. Right? See what I'm saying? I mean, that's the kind of thing that people say. If this was on one of the news networks, I can hear the talking heads say about the Nebuchadnezzar dream. Well, who knows if that was really Nebuchadnezzar's dream or not? Maybe Nebuchadnezzar really just wanted this guy, and just excuse it off. I mean, literally, people have a way when they don't like someone of just rewriting history. It's not always true. Shocking, really, the kind of things that we'll say about others, so as not to take responsibility for our own failures. So Daniel's enemies devise a plan to trap Darius, because Darius, by the way, is a king. He doesn't want to throw Daniel into the lion's den, but they lock Darius by following his own rules, that once he makes a rule, once he makes a law, even he can't take it back. And so he traps Darius into throwing Daniel into the lion's den. So Daniel remains faithful. And that brings us to number 6. And this, of course, is what you typically think of when you think of Daniel in the lion's den. Depend upon God for protection and justice. Rely upon God for protection and justice. When God, we're reading verse 22 and 24 out of chapter 6, my God sent his angel and he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me. And then at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and they were thrown into the lion's den. And by the way, there's a very descriptive thing that I'm not reading, but they didn't even make it to the floor. Okay, if you get what I'm saying. So there's children here, so I'm not going to go into the details, the gory details. All right, but that would be a long night, wouldn't it be? I mean, just stop and think for just a moment. Daniel in the lion's den. Wouldn't that be a long night? I mean, in the middle of the night, maybe a lion wakes up and he's in the mood for a snack. And you're sitting right there. But when we read this biblical account, we get the sense, and this is kind of fascinating, really, because we don't get any details at all about Daniel. I cannot tell you what went through Daniel's mind. I can't tell you about the prayer that Daniel had in the lion's den. We're not given any details about whether Daniel was worried or not. We don't know anything about that from the Bible. What do we hear about Daniel in the lion's den? This is fascinating. If you haven't read this for a while, go back and read it. You know who's really worried about Daniel? King Darius. Darius stays up all night. Darius can't get a wink of sleep for fear of what might be happening in the lion's den. By the way, can you imagine a society that keeps a lion's den just for punishment? That's the kind of place that Daniel finds himself in. But Daniel, we read this, we are told this, that Daniel was not alone with the lion. God sent his angel. And I can't help but wonder if the angel did a whole lot more than just shut the lions' mouths. Perhaps remember what angels are? Angels are messengers, right? Perhaps the messenger, opened his own mouth to Daniel, and in so doing gave him comfort, gave him peace, kept his mind off the danger. I do know this, that the next morning there came retribution to those who had accused Daniel. And this is an important lesson for all of us students. You need to listen to this part too, especially for how things go in school, because you know how you find yourself in cliques sometimes, and how you find yourself in groups, and sometimes you find yourself being part of a group that's accusing somebody else. You want to be very cautious about that, careful about that, because the next morning came retribution to those who had accused Daniel. And that's an important lesson for us. Be careful, be extra careful of the people games that you play. You never know when it comes back to bite you, as we see here in the lion's den, and those even that you love. I would give you, and I put these verses down for your own private study, Psalm 37, 27 to 29, and Romans chapter 12, verse 19, gives us a lot of lesson about how we should handle, when we're angry, how we should handle vengeance, how we should handle retribution. All right? Because we read that God himself will ultimately bring justice. So if you feel that you are unfairly treated, let God handle that vengeance, because nobody will handle it better than him. All right.